When a military unit decides to shield its own, even the highest ranks of the Pentagon usually find themselves hitting a brick wall. For over a year, the 340 elite Marines of Alpha Company had successfully buried an internal logistics anomaly, relying on an unyielding, unbreakable brotherhood of silence. But on a Tuesday morning, an independent civilian investigator with zero military rank walked into their briefing room entirely alone. She carried no weapons, no threats, and no grand speech. Within minutes, she did what no general could do. She completely dismantled their defense, proving that the most dangerous weapon in a military investigation isn't force, but undeniable data. The desert sun over 29 Palms, California does not forgive. It bakes the earth until the horizon vibrates with heat waves, creating a brutal landscape designed specifically to test the limits of human endurance. It was here that the 3rd Battalion, Alpha Company, fondly known in elite military circles as the Phantoms, called home. 340 men, comprised of seasoned combat veterans, lethal scouts, and heavy weapons specialists who had survived multiple deployments in the most hostile environments across the globe. They were the pride of the regiment. Their reputation was built on absolute compliance with the mission, brotherhood, and an unyielding, unbreakable wall of silence. In the military, there's a concept known as the unit mindset. When you live, bleed, and fight alongside the same 340 men, you cease to operate as individuals. You become a single, massive organism. If one part of the organism is threatened, the entire body reacts to protect it. The Phantoms were masters of this defense mechanism. They knew exactly how to navigate the strict hierarchy of the military, how to shield their own from outside scrutiny, and how to make sure that whatever happened within the boundaries of the battalion stayed strictly within the battalion. To any civilian investigator, auditor, or outside authority, they were an impenetrable fortress, a black box that could not be cracked. On this particular morning, the energy inside the main briefing auditorium was thick with casual arrogance. The men were recovering from a grueling 3-week field exercise. They were dirty, exhausted, but riding high on the adrenaline of another successful evaluation. Laughter echoed across the tiered rows of seats. Cigars were hidden away in pockets, and boots were propped up on chairs. They felt secure in their domain. They were under the impression that they had just executed a flawless operation, one that would cement their legacy and guarantee promotions across the board. They believed they were untouchable because, historically, they always had been. But leadership at the highest levels of the Pentagon had noticed a pattern. For over 18 months, anomalies had begun to surface in the battalion's operational logs. Discrepancies in high-tier equipment tracking, unexplainable tactical delays during joint agency exercises, and a sudden sharp rise in classified data access requests that didn't align with their active mission parameters. Every time an internal military inquiry was launched, it hit a brick wall. The chain of command within the battalion would seamlessly absorb the questions, provide perfectly formatted, sterile reports, and bury the truth under mountains of red tape. The system was protecting itself. The 340 Marines were a brotherhood, and they had successfully frozen out every investigator the military had thrown at them. Realizing that standard military channels were useless against a united front of this magnitude, the Department of Defense did something unprecedented. They bypassed the standard military police, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and the Internal Affairs Bureaus entirely. Instead, they reached outside the traditional chain of command to a highly specialized, independent Federal Oversight Division, a unit whose investigators held high-level civilian military clearance, operating with the direct authority of the Secretary of Defense. These were individuals who didn't care about medals, didn't care about unit pride, and could not be intimidated by a uniform. At exactly 08:45 hours, the commanding officer of the battalion received a flash override order on his secure terminal. It was a single sentence. All personnel attached to Alpha Company are ordered to assemble in the main auditorium immediately. All communication devices are to be confiscated at the door. External audit in progress. The announcement was met with groans and mocking smiles throughout the barracks. The Marines figured it was just another routine bureaucrat coming to check serial numbers on rifles or audit their fuel consumption logs. They had played this game 100 times. They knew exactly what to say, which documents to show, and how to smile politely while revealing absolutely nothing. They filed into the auditorium, 340 men filling the seats, creating an overwhelming wall of camouflage, muscle, and combat experience. The air was filled with the low hum of hushed voices, a collective shrug of indifference. Then, the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium clicked open. The room didn't fall silent immediately. Instead, a wave of confusion rippled through the rows of Marines. Walking down the center aisle was not a high-ranking general with a chest full of ribbons. It was not a team of heavily armed federal agents. It was a single woman. She wore a simple, dark-tailored suit. Her hair was tied back neatly, and her expression was completely neutral, neither angry nor intimidated. She carried nothing but a sleek, matte black digital tablet and a single, remarkably thin manila folder under her arm. She didn't look at the men as she walked past them. She didn't acknowledge the hard, piercing stares of 340 combat veterans trying to read her intention. She simply walked with an unnerving, calm deliberation straight toward the front podium. The contrast was stark, almost surreal. A lone civilian woman standing at the base of an amphitheater, surrounded entirely by a massive, hostile force of elite warriors who looked down at her with a mix of amusement and quiet defiance. As she reached the podium, she didn't adjust the microphone. She didn't ask for order. She merely placed her folder down, tapped the screen of her tablet, and looked up. When her eyes swept across the room, the casual smirks on the faces of the front-row veterans began to fade. There was no fear in her eyes. There was no hesitation. There was only the cold, calculated precision of someone who already knew every single secret hidden in that room. The silence began to spread from the front row to the back, heavy and suffocating, as 340 Marines collectively realized that the game had officially changed. The silence that filled the auditorium was not immediate, nor was it a sign of respect. It was a tactical pause. The 340 Marines of Alpha Company were trained to observe, calculate, and identify threats before reacting. Looking down at the single civilian woman standing behind the podium, the initial shock shifted back into a cold, collective indifference. They had faced congressional inquiries, high-ranking inspectors general, and seasoned military lawyers before. Each time, the unit's defensive wall had held. They knew the rules of engagement in a bureaucratic war. Never volunteer information, answer only the exact question asked, and rely on the sheer complexity of military supply lines to exhaust the outsider. The woman adjusted her glasses, placed her digital tablet flat on the wooden surface, and opened the single manila folder she had carried into the room. She did not introduce herself by name. She did not state which specific federal oversight committee she represented. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked the sharp, booming cadence of a drill instructor, but it possessed an icy clarity that cut straight through the heavy humidity of the room. She spoke flatly, reading directly from her screen, addressing the crowd not as a group of heroes, but as numbers on a ledger. On March 14th of last year, she began, her tone devoid of emotion. Alpha Company was deployed to the overseas logistics hub at Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. According to the official manifest signed by your commanding officer, your unit returned with exactly 42 tactical communication arrays, model AN/PRC-117G. The inventory list matches perfectly with the Department of Defense tracking system. Every serial number was logged, stamped, and approved by the base commander upon arrival back here at 29 Palms. In the middle rows of the auditorium, a few senior staff sergeants subtly leaned back in their chairs. A faint, nearly invisible wave of relief washed over the front lines. They knew this case. It was a routine equipment audit. The paperwork for those communication arrays was flawless. They had spent weeks ensuring that every single signature was legitimate, every rubber stamp was perfectly aligned, and every piece of metal was accounted for in the warehouse. If this civilian had traveled all the way to the California desert just to question their administrative bookkeeping, she was wasting her time. "The paperwork," she continued, pausing to look up and lock eyes with a master sergeant in the third row, "is absolutely beautiful. In fact, it is too beautiful. It shows a level of administrative perfection that simply does not exist in a live combat zone. When a unit undergoes a rapid reassignment during a sandstorm in East Africa, mistakes happen, forms get stained, checklists get delayed, but Alpha Company's logs remained pristine. It was almost as if they were written after the fact, in a quiet office with the sole purpose of matching a predetermined database." The room grew slightly colder. The casual shifting of boots on the concrete floor stopped. The vertical logic of her argument was beginning to take hold. She wasn't just checking the boxes, she was analyzing the human behavior behind the ink. "When our office noticed this anomaly," she said, tapping her finger on the tablet to bring up a fresh set of data, "we didn't look at your supply forms, we bypassed them entirely. Instead, we pulled the satellite telemetry data from the commercial shipping containers that left the port of Doralé during the exact 48-hour window your unit was staging its departure. We cross-referenced the weight signatures of your company's specific cargo crates at the time of loading against the weight signatures recorded upon their arrival at the port of San Diego." She paused, letting the weight of that single word, telemetry, sink into the minds of the men. Military logistics was a massive, clunky machine, but physics never lied. A standard, empty ANPRC-117G transit case weighs exactly 24 pounds. When fully loaded with the operational array, the battery packs, and the secondary encryption modules, it weighs 68.2 pounds. According to the port scales in San Diego, your crates were lighter by exactly 1,764 pounds. The paperwork says the equipment was inside those crates. The laws of gravity say they were not. The suffocating tension began to grip the auditorium. The 340 Marines sat frozen. The wall of silence they had relied on for 18 months was built on the assumption that an investigator would only look where they were allowed to look. They expected her to demand to see the warehouse. They expected her to ask for the keys to the arms locker, where 42 identical communication arrays were currently sitting on shelves, perfectly clean and tagged. They had already prepared for that. They had borrowed identical units from Bravo Company to cover the deficit during the physical inspection. It was an old trick, one that had worked against military inspectors who were rushed for time. But she hadn't asked to see the warehouse. She had looked at the planet from space, analyzing numbers that could not be forged or altered by a friendly supply clerk. "For the past year," she continued, her voice remaining perfectly level, "this unit has maintained an ironclad agreement. You believed that if everyone stayed silent, the discrepancy would eventually be written off as a combat loss or an administrative error. You believed your Brotherhood would protect the individuals who made those arrays disappear. But a Brotherhood only works when the consequences are shared equally, and today they are not." She closed the manila folder with a soft, definitive snap that echoed like a pistol shot in the silent room. She looked out across the sea of camouflage, her expression completely detached from the human drama unfolding in front of her. "I am not here to negotiate with Alpha Company," she said quietly. "I am here to inform you that the Secretary of Defense has already signed a systemic freeze on all promotional tracks, transfer requests, and specialized school assignments for every single person in this room, effective 30 minutes ago. The wall of silence you built to protect a few corrupt actors has just become the prison that holds all 340 of you." The psychological weight of a collective punishment is a strange thing to witness, especially among men who are trained to endure extreme physical torture. Physical pain can be shared, it can be absorbed through shared misery and turned into a badge of honor. But the sudden, absolute freezing of 340 careers is a completely different kind of pressure. In an elite military unit, career progression is everything. It is the fuel that keeps the machine running. The young corporals looking to make sergeant to support their growing families, the ambitious lieutenants aiming for command positions, the veteran staff non-commissioned officers tracking toward a comfortable retirement, all of it was tied directly to their unblemished records. With one flat statement, the civilian investigator had turned their collective strength into their greatest vulnerability. A low collective murmur threatened to break out across the rows, but it was instantly suppressed by the sheer habits of discipline. Nobody spoke, but the body language in the auditorium shifted dramatically. Men who had been leaning back with defensive, folded arms were now sitting rigidly straight. Eyes darted sideways, scanning the faces of peers and subordinates. The unified front was no longer a shield, it had become a shared anchor dragging them all to the bottom. The investigator picked up her digital tablet again, the glow from the screen reflecting softly off her face. She didn't give them time to recover from the shock. She understood that in interrogation, the moment of impact must be followed immediately by relentless, undeniable pressure. Vertical logic dictated that you never allow the target to find their footing once they begin to slip. "Let us be entirely clear about the mechanics of this situation," she said, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. The Department of Defense does not believe that 340 Marines conspired to sell high-tier military encryption hardware to foreign entities. We are fully aware that the vast majority of the men sitting in this room had absolutely nothing to do with the physical removal of those 42 communication arrays from Camp Lemonnier. Most of you were pulling security details, packing your personal gear, or recovering from malaria treatments. She paused, looking up from her screen, her gaze deliberately sweeping across the lower-ranking enlisted men who sat toward the back of the room. "The crime committed by the majority of this room is not theft," she stated flatly. "The crime is compliance. It is the deliberate decision to look away when a truck was loaded at an unauthorized time. It is the decision to sign a sub-manifest without verifying the contents of the crate because a superior officer told you it was already taken care of. It is the belief that loyalty to your immediate circle supersedes your oath to the Constitution. That is the illusion we are shattering today." She tapped her screen, and a massive projection screen descending behind her roared to life. The room didn't show dramatic photos or surveillance footage. Instead, it displayed a highly complex, color-coded network map. It looked like a spiderweb of digital connections, showing financial accounts, encrypted message timestamps, and specific logistics access codes. "To the individuals who actually engineered this operation," she continued, her tone remaining completely clinical, "you relied on the assumption that we would try to prove where the hardware went after it left the port of San Diego. You assumed that because the black market for military-grade encryption is deeply hidden, the trail would go cold. But you forgot that every single piece of modern military equipment contains a passive, hard-coded identification chip that communicates with secure, automated networks whenever a diagnostic check is run." The air in the front rows felt completely drained. A master sergeant's jaw tightened so hard that a muscle in his cheek began to twitch violently. 3 weeks ago, the investigator revealed, one of the missing AN/PRC-117G arrays was powered on inside a private contractor facility just 40 miles outside of Las Vegas. It wasn't being used for espionage. It was being reverse-engineered by a civilian defense startup looking to secure a lucrative government contract by cloning the proprietary frequency-hopping technology. They didn't steal it, they bought it. And they bought it from a shell corporation registered to a private address right here in San Bernardino County. The narrative was tightening. It was no longer a vague administrative audit, it was a localized surgical strike against specific targets inside the room. The 340 Marines could feel the space shrinking around them. The collective armor of the unit was fracturing because now every innocent man in that room knew exactly what and who they were sacrificing their entire futures to protect. "The Shell Corporation," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried to the very back wall, "was funded using a series of offshore accounts, but the primary logistics coordinator who authorized the container bypass at the San Diego docks used a specific, restricted digital signature key. A key that belongs to only 3 individuals currently attached to this battalion." She laid the tablet back down on the podium. The projection screen remained lit, casting a harsh, clinical blue light over the silent warriors of Alpha Company. "I am not going to call those 3 individuals down to the stage," she said quietly. "I am not going to give them the dramatic moment of an arrest in front of their men. Instead, I am leaving this room. The lockdown on your files will remain in place. At exactly 1200 hours, less than 3 hours from now, a formal military tribunal will convene in the building next door. If the names of those 3 individuals are not voluntarily delivered to my office by a representative of this company before that clock strikes 12, the promotional freeze becomes permanent, and the entire battalion will face a dishonorable administrative discharge for systemic institutional failure." She didn't wait for a reaction. She didn't look back to see the shock on their faces. She simply picked up her single manila folder, tucked it under her arm, and walked away from the podium. Her heels clicked with the same steady, unnerving rhythm against the hard floor as she moved up the center aisle, walking out of the room entirely alone, leaving 340 humbled warriors trapped in the absolute silence of their own making. The heavy double doors clicked shut behind the civilian investigator, and the sound resonated through the auditorium like the dropping of a vault gate. For a long, agonizing minute, nobody moved. The 340 Marines of Alpha Company remained locked in their seats, staring straight ahead at the empty wooden podium and the glowing blue-lit network map on the projection screen. The silence is no longer tactical, it was paralyzed. The reality of the situation was settling into the bone marrow of every man present. They had faced mortar fire, extreme sleep deprivation, and the chaotic brutality of active combat zones, but those were physical threats with tangible targets. This was an invisible digital trap, and it had been sprung with absolute cold-world precision. Slowly, the rigid military posture of the room began to dissolve into a frantic internal panic. The unity that had defined the Phantoms for years was disintegrating in real time. First came the looks, subtle, sharp, and loaded with suspicion. Men who had bled together in the dust of distant valley outposts were suddenly looking at the person to their left and right with a terrifying question in their eyes. Is it you? Are you the one who destroyed my future? Captain Thomas Vance, the company commander, finally stepped forward from the front row. His face was entirely pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the front row barrier. He turned to face his men. Normally, his voice was a dominant force that could rally a chaotic line under fire, but now it sounded hollow, drained of its usual authority. "Stand down," Vance commanded, quietly, though no one had actually moved. "Nobody leaves this room. Guards, lock the side entrances. Master Sergeant, get the platoon leaders up here right now." The 3-hour countdown was officially ticking. The vertical logic of the investigator's strategy was working exactly as intended. She had removed the external enemy and forced the battalion to look inward. When a massive group is threatened with total destruction to protect a tiny minority, the collective survival instinct always overrides institutional loyalty. It is a fundamental law of human behavior, and even the elite training of the United States Marine Corps cannot override it. In the front corner of the stage, the platoon leaders gathered around Captain Vance. The atmosphere was incredibly hostile. "Sir, this is a bluff," a young first lieutenant whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. They can't just freeze an entire company's promotions. The Commandant of the Marine Corps wouldn't allow a civilian agency to butcher a frontline combat unit over administrative discrepancies. We need to call the regimental commander immediately. The regimental commander is the one who authorized her entry into this compound, Lieutenant, Captain Vance said, his voice flat and bitter. Did you not see the flash override on my terminal? She isn't representing a civilian committee. She is operating under a direct mandate from the Secretary of Defense. The Pentagon didn't send a lawyer to argue with us. They sent an executioner. The freeze is already live in the administrative database. My own transfer paperwork to the War College was flagged and rejected 20 minutes ago. The realization hit the huddle of officers like a physical blow. The system was not coming to save them, because the system was the one pulling the trigger. Behind them, in the tiered rows of the auditorium, the separation between the ranks was becoming visible. The lower enlisted Marines, the corporals and lance corporals who formed the physical backbone of the company, were huddled together in hushed, furious conversations. They were the ones with the most to lose and the least to gain. They didn't drive luxury vehicles, they didn't have offshore accounts, and they certainly hadn't seen a single dollar from the sale of advanced encryption hardware. They were the ones who pulled 12-hour guard shifts in 40-degree heat, trusting that their clean records would eventually earn them a sergeant's stripe and a slightly better life for their families. "I'm not losing my career for this," a corporal muttered, his voice carrying just far enough to cause a staff sergeant 3 rows down to turn around with a warning glare. "Keep your mouth shut, Corporal," the staff sergeant hissed. "We hold the line. We don't break for a suit." "With all due respect, Staff Sergeant," the corporal shot back, his eyes flashing with a dangerous defiance. "Your career is almost over. You've got your 20 years locked in. I've got a wife and a newborn baby at home, and I'm currently being threatened with a dishonorable discharge because someone in this room wanted to sell government property to a tech startup in Nevada. If you think I'm going to take the fall for a thief, you are entirely mistaken." The exchange was a symptom of a deeper, fatal fracture. The unyielding wall of silence was built on the absolute certainty that everyone was protecting a righteous cause, the survival of the group. But now that the cause was revealed to be simple, self-serving financial corruption, the moral foundation of that silence had completely collapsed. The Brotherhood was no longer a sacred bond. It was a luxury they could no longer afford. The clock on the wall read 0945. 2 hours and 15 minutes remained, and the armor of the Untouchable battalion was splintering into 340 separate pieces. By 10:30 hours, the air inside the briefing auditorium felt heavy enough to suffocate. The desert heat outside was rising, but inside, a cold, calculated desperation had taken complete control. The 3-hour timeline was halfway gone, and the psychological architecture of the 3rd Battalion had completely shifted. The initial shock had morphed into a quiet, deadly calculation. In combat, when a position becomes untenable, a commander orders a retreat. But here, there was no perimeter to fall back to. The data projected on the screen behind the podium remained illuminated, a constant, unforgiving reminder that their invisible adversary already knew the ending to the game they were playing. Captain Vance stood at the center of the stage, flanked by his 3 platoon commanders. The internal investigation within the unit had begun, not with formal questioning, but with a brutal, unspoken process of elimination. The investigator had dropped a crucial piece of information before leaving: the restricted digital signature key used to authorize the container bypass belonged to only 3 individuals attached to the battalion. In a unit of 340 men, only a select few had access to high-tier logistics networks, the authority to override port manifests, and the clearance to sign off on classified equipment movements without triggering an immediate red flag. The circle of suspicion had shrunk from a battalion-wide dragnet to a handful of men sitting in the very front rows. "We are running out of time," Captain Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper as he looked at his platoon leaders. The Pentagon didn't just freeze our files, they isolated our network. I tried to ping the regimental data hub. Nothing. We are completely dark. At 12 o'clock, the hammer drops. I need a name, and I need it now. First Platoon Commander, Lieutenant Miller, looked back at the rows of enlisted men. Sir, the men are turning. If we don't give her what she wants, we aren't just losing our promotions. The lower enlisted are already talking about breaking chain of command and walking over to the tribunal building individually. If one lance corporal goes rogue and cuts a deal to save his own skin, the entire unit loses its integrity completely. We have to handle this internally before it turns into a mutiny. The vertical logic of the situation was absolute. The Brotherhood could only survive if the sacrifice was voluntary, but there is no volunteering when a civilian auditor holds an unalterable digital ledger. Lieutenant Miller walked away from the stage and stepped directly into the first row of seats. He stopped in front of Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne, a highly decorated logistics chief who had been with Alpha Company for 6 years. Thorne was a mountain of a man, his chest covered in combat ribbons, his face a mask of absolute indifference. For the past 18 months, Thorne had been the man who managed the battalion's shipping containers, the man who knew every dock worker in San Diego, and the man who handled the administrative transit paperwork with robotic perfection. "Marcus," Lieutenant Miller said, his voice remarkably calm but dripping with an intense underlying gravity. The civilian mentioned a private address in San Bernardino County. She mentioned a shell corporation registered to a residential property just 40 miles outside of Las Vegas. "Your family owns a ranch in Barstow, Marcus. That's right on the county line." The entire front section of the auditorium fell dead silent. The surrounding Marines didn't move a muscle, but every eye shifted to Staff Sergeant Thorne. The wall of silence was finally cracking at its base. Thorne didn't blink. He stared straight ahead at the projection screen, his jaw set like granite. "Sir, my family's property has nothing to do with government communication arrays. I sign the manifests the captain puts in front of me. If a container goes missing at the civilian port, that's a maritime logistics failure, not a Marine Corps failure." The port scales registered a deficit of 1,764 pounds, Marcus, Miller replied, stepping closer, his voice dropping so only the immediate circle could hear. The weight didn't vanish in the ocean. It vanished before the crates were loaded onto the transport vehicles. The digital key used to clear those specific crates belonged to your terminal password. You were the one who signed the pre-clearance codes from Djibouti. Thorne finally turned his head, his eyes locking onto his platoon commander with a cold, defensive glare. "In the field, sir, everybody uses everybody's terminal. You know how the network works during a rapid deployment. Security protocols get dropped when we're trying to meet a shipping deadline." "Not this time," Captain Vance's voice boomed from the stage as he walked down the aisle toward them. The company commander looked down at his seasoned logistics chief, his expression a mixture of profound betrayal and clinical resolve. "I just checked the system access logs from my tactical tablet before the network went completely dark. The specific pre-clearance code for those 42 arrays wasn't entered during the chaos of deployment, Thorne. It was entered at 3:30 in the morning from an IP address mapped to the officer's transit lounge, a lounge you were clearing out alone while the rest of the company was staging at the airfield." The pressure in the room reached its absolute breaking point. The 340 Marines watched as the vertical logic of the evidence systematically stripped away the logistics chief's defenses. The collective strength of the unit could no longer protect him because the unit itself had become his accuser. The clock on the wall now read 11:15. 45 minutes remained before total career execution, and the man who had engineered the untouchable system was finally standing completely exposed. The final 45 minutes of the countdown did not feel like a ticking clock. They felt like a slow, heavy descent. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne sat completely isolated in the front row, a sudden and profound vacuum of space opening up around him as the Marines in his immediate vicinity subtly shifted their chairs away. The Brotherhood that had defined Alpha Company for nearly a decade had not vanished, but it had recalibrated. It had remembered its true purpose. A military unit does not exist to shield an individual from the consequences of personal corruption. It exists to protect the nation and the integrity of the collective whole. Captain Vance stood directly over his logistics chief. He did not yell. He did not issue a furious reprimand. The gravity of what was about to happen transcended the standard dramatics of military discipline. "Marcus," Vance said, his voice quiet, steady, and entirely absolute. "You have 30 minutes before 340 careers are permanently ended. You have 30 minutes before young men who have done nothing but serve their country honorably are sent home with a stain on their names that they can never wash out. I am not going to order you to march across that courtyard, but if you do not walk through those doors voluntarily, I will personally carry the digital access logs to the tribunal room myself." Thorne looked down at his hands, his knuckles rough and scarred from years of mechanical work, heavy lifting, and combat operations. The vertical logic of his situation was flawless and inescapable. He had built a labyrinth of paperwork, offshore accounts, and shell corporations, believing that the sheer complexity of global logistics would protect him. He had trusted that the unyielding, traditional silence of his fellow Marines would provide the ultimate smokescreen. But he had failed to realize that data is an unfeeling, objective witness. You cannot intimidate a satellite scale, and you cannot bargain with an independent digital ledger. Slowly, heavily, Staff Sergeant Thorne stood up. The uniform that had once represented his highest honor now felt like an impossible weight on his shoulders. He did not look back at the tiered rows of the auditorium. He did not look at the 340 pairs of eyes tracking his every movement. He simply adjusted the collar of his camouflage utility uniform, took a deep, steadying breath, and turned toward the center aisle. The walk down the middle of the auditorium was the longest of his life. The silence from the Marines was absolute, but it was no longer the defiant, arrogant silence of the morning. It was a humbled, somber quiet. They were watching the systematic dismantling of an illusion. They were learning in real time that true power does not lie in a uniform, a weapon, or a collective refusal to cooperate with authority. True power lies in the unyielding precision of truth and accountability. Thorne reached the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium, pushed them open, and stepped out into the blazing, unforgiving heat of the California desert sun. Less than 15 minutes later, at exactly 11:45 hours, the digital display on Captain Vance's tactical tablet flashed once. The red notification banner that had frozen every promotional track, transfer request, and school assignment for Alpha Company turned a solid, vibrant green. The systemic lockdown was lifted. The administrative database of the United States Marine Corps resumed its normal operations, clearing the paths for the corporals, the lieutenants, and the honest veterans who had earned their future through sacrifice rather than deception. The civilian investigator had already left the base. She did not stay to watch the tribunal convene. She did not stay to see Thorne hand over the names of his 2 civilian logistics accomplices in San Bernardino County. She had executed her mission with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon, leaving behind a unit that was profoundly shaken, deeply quieted, but ultimately saved from its own internal decay. They had walked into that briefing room believing they were answerable to no one. They walked out knowing that the rules apply to everyone and that a single, unaccompanied voice armed with undeniable facts can humble the most formidable force on Earth. True loyalty isn't about protecting someone who breaks the code. It's about standing up for the integrity of the people who keep it. If you believe that accountability matters more than any title or uniform, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel for more deep, unvarnished stories of real-world justice. Drop a comment below and let me know. Did Captain Vance handle this internal betrayal the right way? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next narrative.